Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. On Tuesday, a new report was released by the Israel-based human rights organization B'Tselem. The report criticizes Israel's investigations into the killing of nearly 1,400 Palestinian civilians during the 2014 war on Gaza. This comes days after the United States and Israel signed a historic agreement granting Israel the largest U.S. military aid package in history. Today, we are going to take a continuing look into the agreement with a political economist, Shir Hever. Shir is a researcher for the Alternative Information Center based in Jerusalem and Beit Shor. He joins us today from Germany. Thank you so much for joining us, Shir.
Thanks for having me, Sharmini.
Shir, as you know, we've been covering this MOU between Israel and the United States in a few interviews, the one that is on our site today with Larry Wilkerson, as well as the agreement was signed, we did an interview with Rania Khalek and Phyllis Bennis. And I understand you would like to respond to some of the claims that were made, but mainly something that Larry Wilkerson said in his interview, that this was the largest aid package ever signed between Israel and the United States, and also that Israel is a strategic liability to the U.S. Those two claims you wanted to address, so please do.
Right. So I think this aid agreement is very important and very telling about the development in the relation between Israel and the United States. The claim that this is the largest aid package that Israel has ever received is nominally true, but in real terms, it's actually not true. Because if we imagine what would have happened if the U.S. would have kept its aid to Israel constant since 1973, not increased it, but just kept it up to inflation, then today the aid would have been $16 billion a year. And now instead, the United States signed a deal with Israel for $3.8 billion a year. 3.8 is more in nominal terms than the $3 billion that Israel received back in 1973, but its purchasing power is less than a quarter of what it was back then. And I think that means that there is an erosion in the aid, and I think we can learn a lot from this ongoing erosion. What exactly is changing in the relations between the two countries? And the main thing to understand is that there is actually not one hegemonic interest in the U.S. side and not one hegemonic interest on the Israeli side.
And what do you mean by that? Who else has interest in this MOU?
Yeah, this brings me to the second point, the second argument that was made by Lawrence Wilkerson, that that Israel is a strategic liability for the United States. It's a strategic liability for the United States military, of course, and for the U.S. Foreign policy in the Middle East. That I completely agree. But for the U.S. military industry, the military-industrial complex, the arms companies, Israel serves a very important role because they test and demonstrate the effectiveness of U.S. weaponry. And this is what the aid is about. It means that the United States gives Israel weapons. It's a massive subsidy of the U.S. taxpayers to the U.S. arms companies, which then sell their weapons at full price, but the money is paid by U.S. taxpayers. The weapons are used against Palestinians, against Syrians, against Lebanese, by the Israeli military, and then the U.S. companies can learn from that and improve their weapons and also market them better and so on. So for that, Israel is not a strategic liability, but actually, to borrow a term coined by Andrew Feinstein, a scholar of the arms industry, it turns Israel into the U.S. shop window. So when customers of U.S. weaponry want to see how U.S. weapons function, they look at Israel and what Israel is doing with these weapons.
And while this is somewhat of a subsidy for the U.S. military-industrial complex, the political consequences of this decision to Israel in terms of eliminating subsidies for the Israel arms industry has great implications. Explain that and tell us more about the consequences and the implications it will have.
Yeah, one Israeli journalist, Nehemiah Stressler, has actually written that this deal, this MOU, is the way for President Obama to have his revenge on Netanyahu, actually delivering a terrible deal and a humiliating deal that then Netanyahu suffers from. And indeed, there is a lot of criticism within Israel about this deal because of 3 points. The first point is indeed what I mentioned, that in real terms, the aid is not actually increasing. The second point is that there is a clause in the term that makes it impossible for the Israeli government to seek additions when there's a certain need, and to appeal directly to Congress in order to ask for more money. So they sign the deal and they take it as it is, and only under extreme emergencies they can make an extra request, and then they have to give the money back. So actually, the aid is very clearly delineated. And the third point, which I think is the most important point, is that the Israeli arms industry, there's also an Israeli arms industry, and that one is excluded from the aid deal. Now, Israel is the largest recipient of US military aid in the world. There is no contesting that. But Israel also has a privilege that no other country in the world has. They can use a portion of that aid to finance their own arms industry. That means that a lot of companies in Israel are actually developing weaponry and other combat systems which are designed to be used by the Israeli military, but not funded directly by the US Ministry of Defense, but rather through the aid from the United States. And this is a privilege that applies to 26% of the aid. And Israel is the only country in the world that has that privilege. And that privilege is going to be revoked. And when President Obama started the negotiations with Israel about the about the aid package, and of course there was some expectation the United States is going to increase aid because as a kind of compensation for the Iran deal. Then President Obama made this comment. He said, this privilege of the 26% that Israel can use for its own arms industry has to be canceled for the mutual interests of both sides. I think this is a very cynical statement. I think it was completely understood that it's not a mutual interest of both sides. It's only in the interest of the US arms companies that this privilege will be revoked. And for the Israeli military industry, this is a threat to their very existence. Something that, of course, I don't mourn, the fact that Israeli arms companies are a threat of disappearing. I, of course, think that it would be a very good thing if Israel would stop producing weapons and exporting them. But one must understand that within the Israeli political system, the arms industry is extremely important. There's no other country in the world where the arms industry is so important to the economy as it is for Israel. And that's where we see a very interesting development within Israel, that this part of the economy and that part of the political sphere that is completely funded by the US aid and by the arms exports and the wars is now receiving a terrible blow. And there's no coincidence that shortly after President Obama made that statement, that it's in the interest of both sides to revoke the privilege, that Netanyahu fired his Minister of Defense, Moshe Ya'alon, who was very deeply embedded within that Israeli security elite of the big arms manufacturers. So he was kicked out. And instead, Netanyahu appointed a defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, who is not part of that elite, who is an outsider, and who doesn't care so much who's going to be the leaders of the arms industry. And he's trying to push his own people there, but he doesn't promote people from inside the industry. And as Netanyahu is now fighting to get rid of the influence of that military brass, the military elite inside Israel, and to push them out of the political decision-making process, the new MOU package means that this security elite is actually going to lose the branch that they're sitting on. They're going to lose their main source of income when the US will cut out that privilege.
Now, Shir, there's another component to this, which is rather interesting, that this is a 10-year agreement. What implications does that have? I mean, President Obama obviously wanted to lock in this deal for 10 years.
The implications are, first of all, that no matter how high the inflation in the United States is going to be and how much the dollar is going to lose its value, Israel cannot get more than $3.8 billion a year. Second, it means that this during those 10 years, the Israeli government is prevented from making appeals to the US government for extra aid. And that's not a small thing, because if we look at the last couple of years, every year Israel made a special appeal to the US Congress, asking more money for missiles or for anti-missile systems and so on. And all these projects were kind of ways for pro-Israeli, mainly Republican Congress people and senators to show their support for Israel by spending a few millions there, a few hundred millions over here, and that's going to be stopped for the next 10 years. That is going to be prevented, and Senator Graham has already made a statement to Netanyahu. How could you do this to us? How could you sign a deal that makes it impossible for us in the Senate to show our support for Israel? And the third thing about such a long-term agreement is that it allows this phasing out of the Israeli special privilege to start to be spread out gradually, not be in one blow. So that means that politically it gives Netanyahu some time before the full brunt of the full ramifications of this decision are going to be felt. And I think Netanyahu is really counting his days in office and trying to make sure that he can get as many as possible and stay prime minister for as long as he can. So if this is phased out, he's hoping maybe there won't be mass layoffs and thousands of new unemployed people from the arms industry in Israel on his watch when he's still prime minister.
Right. And further, we should note that Netanyahu had actually asked for $50 billion in aid, but got 39 over 10 years. So, Shir,
Netanyahu actually played a very interesting political trick with this 50 billion, because what he did was he told the senior negotiators from the military industry, his big generals and arms manufacturers, he told them, you should go wild, ask for whatever you want, make the most outrageous demands of the US, knowing full well that they're not going to get their wish. But this way he can shift the blame a little bit on them and make their demands seem unreasonable. And he's trying to sell the Israeli public on this idea that somehow he got a good deal from the US, when I think it's quite clear that he didn't get a good deal at all.
All right, Shir, I thank you so much for your analysis, and we're looking forward to having you back very soon.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.